There are dozens of different methods and exercises on the internet to release the psoas muscle. But in this video, I'm going to rank the most common ones, and that way you can pick the best one for you. Now, in order to understand why certain methods and exercises may be better than others, we first need to understand what the psoas does, so that way we can understand the best ways to target it to release it. The psoas muscle attaches at your lumbar vertebrae right here and runs down through your hip and attaches onto the femur right here. So this is important to appreciate because when a muscle gets in a shortened or contracted state, it is going to pull those attachment sites closer together. So when this muscle is in that shortened state, you're going to see this femur bone rotate out into what we call external rotation like this, but also that's going to occur in the presence of a pelvis that is being tilted forward. When this pelvis tilts forward, the lumbar lordosis or low back arch increases. So typically people that have a psoas in a shortened and tight state have increased low back arches, anterior pelvic tilt if you will, but also femurs that are rotated out into external rotation. Now, the last thing to appreciate about this is that when the pelvis is indeed tilted forward, that is going to push the center of gravity of our lower body forward like this. So a greatly underappreciated aspect of a tight psoas is that it is in the presence of a center of gravity of our body, and particularly lower body and pelvis, that is being pushed forward in space. And you can see how that would happen when I do this. Therefore, a good intervention to address a tight psoas would be to address those three common problems. We need to create more length in the muscle, which oftentimes results in more of a posteriorly tilted pelvis, which is going to allow us to be in more of a hip extended position because a psoas, which is a hip flexor, pulls us into a hip flexed position like this. So we want more length. But we also want to take care of the idea that typically people with tight psoas have femurs that are turned out into external rotation. We want to pull them back within the hip socket a little bit more into what we call internal rotation of the femur. And lastly, and this is something that a lot of those common psoas interventions are missing, is we need to fix the center of gravity within the body. And this is key because with this shoved forward center of gravity within our pelvis, that is going to create an environment where we are potentially leaning forward a little. So in order to get a long-term fix, we want to restore more of a neutral center of gravity and a stacked head over rib cage, over pelvis, over our foot in the way that we want. And ideally, we do this by helping restore relatively more of that center of gravity onto our heels rather than being shoved onto our forefoot more so. Starting with the F tier or the lowest tier or the worst tier, least helpful, we have a lacrosse ball psoas release. And this is just not really doing anything. Reason being is that a lacrosse ball is not going to get into your abdomen enough to actually target a psoas muscle. The psoas is so deep within our body. A little lacrosse ball, even though it's hard, is not going to give you enough of a pinpointed target to actually release the psoas in a meaningful way. So this is kind of a waste of your time. Moving into D tier, meaning that it's still not very helpful, but potentially a little more helpful than F tier, we have a chair march. Now, the issue with the chair march is that while it makes sense on the surface to some extent to help get some length through the psoas of the leg that is stretched and help potentially train the hip flexors on the leg that is up on the chair, it's not really going to be very helpful for most people that have really tight psoas because they're not actually going to be able to get into the position very effectively in the first place. If you have a tight psoas and you can't actually get into a hip extended position, then of course you're going to struggle to be in a position which demands a lot of hip extension on the down leg and a lot of hip flexion on the up leg. People just can't manage this position very effectively, and I wouldn't really recommend it to start out for a lot of people. And even if you can do it effectively, I think there are a lot better options. So we're going to keep this one in the D tier. The second D tier exercise is a bird dog. And this is very similar to the chair march in the essence of, sure, I could see how increased core stability, training the obliques a little bit, could have some benefits, especially because That extended leg is in more hip extension, and you're getting length through that psoas muscle. But the problem is that a lot of people can't do these very effectively. You're only really getting a little bit of length through the psoas in a relatively unstable position. And also, you're not really improving the internal rotation capabilities of the hip too much. And also, it is, like I said, relatively unstable, and most people can't do these very effectively at all. That would drive meaningful length through the psoas. So this is a D tier exercise. Okay, now let's move into C tier. And with C tier, these are things that could be helpful, potentially, especially in the short term, but generally aren't going to make a huge impact in the long term. But they could be tools in your toolbox. So let's start out with the most common thing we're going to see on the internet, and that is a half kneeling hip flexor stretch. Why is this in the C tier? Well, it does provide temporary relief. You are getting hip extension of that back leg, which is going to drive length through that psoas. But it's not addressing the true root cause, which is the center of gravity, and also restoring some of the position of the femur within the hip socket that we're looking for. But also, you're just stretching a muscle. And stretching isn't going to educate the body how to actually genuinely move into a hip extended position. And that's what we need to be able to do. We can use a half kneeling stretch or stretches like it to open up space, but then we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do with that space once we have it? And I'm also going to pair with this the lunge stretch, which is something that we commonly see for a tight psoas as well, for similar reasons as what I just described before for the half kneeling stretch. Staying in the C tier, the theme here is stretches, and we're going to be talking about the prone psoas stretch here. Now, again, this could be a nice introductory way to drive some length through the psoas because you're kind of forcing yourself to be in somewhat of a hip extended position with the straight legs. However, you are just pushing your low back into a ton of arching and extension, and typically that is not what people need more of. It is getting some length through the psoas, but it is also coming at the cost of pushing you into a bunch of extension, which for some people could be helpful, but for the majority of people with very chronically tight and shortened psoas muscles, not the best option. And the last one in the C tier is the manual release tool we see for the psoas, specifically designed to hit that muscle. Now, this is going to be better than the F tier lacrosse ball because it is way more targeted and literally more able to pinpoint that psoas and dig into it more. And there is some research to suggest that you can palpate the psoas despite it being very deep within the abdomen and the lower trunk. So this could be a means of opening up space, but it's only exactly that. You're not educating the body to do anything differently. You're just getting very short-term relief. So many times when people do something like this, they'll feel better for 5-10 minutes, maybe an hour tops, and then they go back to how they felt because they're not actually changing the mechanics of their body or improving anything. They're just releasing it. And the body has no reason to not just go back to what it was doing in the first place. Moving into B tier, which is now we're starting to move into stuff that actually could be a little bit more helpful. Things that you might want to consider doing on more of a regular basis. We're going to start with the classic glute bridge and variations of that. The glute bridge could be helpful because it is a good way to start training hip extension or getting the glutes to help pull the pelvis into a more posterior pelvic tilt. And this is good for beginners, but we have to make sure when we're doing this that we aren't pushing beyond our range of motion that we don't have access to. So we need to make sure that we're doing the glute bridge properly and stopping at our genuine end range of hip extension. And we can improve this over time, potentially with other exercises I'm going to talk about too. But I like this because there's a foot component as well. We're training the foot to work with the hip to extend it with the glutes. And I like that because there's center of gravity control in there. Whenever the foot is connected to the ground and you can train hip extension, you have a really good opportunity to properly connect that center of gravity control and also the position of the pelvis with the position of the foot. And I like that because that's more specific to how we actually move and how we actually stand. But the caveat is it has to be done properly. So if you want to see how I would coach a genuinely good glute bridge, check out this video. I'll link it down below in the description. The second one in the B tier is a posterior hip capsule stretch. What this basically means is that we're opening up space in the back of our hip to move into internal rotation. And this can be very helpful because remember, people with tight psoas oftentimes have hips that are stuck out like this and do external rotation in the presence of a forward pelvis. So what we're doing here is we're helping restore the ability for the femur to slide back within the hip socket and opening up space for that. If you stay hung out in this position all the time, then eventually you will lose the ability to move into the back of your hip socket progressively more over time. So a posterior hip capsule stretch can be a phenomenal way to start to open up space you haven't accessed consistently in a long time. I will be linking down below in the description one of my favorite ones. I love doing this, especially as a primer for other exercises in the upper tiers. Now, hopefully you're getting the idea that a tight psoas is a total body problem. If the pelvis is stuck, tilted forward, you have flared ribs, your head's in a position that potentially could be throwing off your center of gravity too, we have to address everything at once. And that's why these lower tier exercises and interventions aren't addressing all of this at once. So they're ranked lower because we need to address the hips, the center of gravity, and also the position of the pelvis relative to that. Nothing does that better than my beginner body restoration program. It's designed for anyone to be able to do. It requires minimal time and equipment, and also it is going to help you address asymmetries too. So let's say you had a psoas that was tighter on one side than the other. This would really help you address that as well. So check it out down below in the description. Okay, now we're moving into the A tier. The A tier is obviously a great place to be, great place to get exercises and interventions from. These are things that on a consistent basis can create short-term and long-term changes, but they're not quite the top S tier yet. But let's hit them. Let's get into some of my favorite things. One of my favorite exercises for not only stretching the psoas, but also retraining hip extension is this exercise right here. It doesn't require much other than just a table, a firm surface like maybe a kitchen counter or even a massage table is obviously ideal, but also a foam roller, and that's really it. And you can adjust this based off of how limited you are in hip extension. I love this because you are going to be at the relative end range of your hip extension. You can adjust how much support is underneath your leg as needed. And then you're gonna push down into that roller with your thigh, which is going to engage your hamstring muscle. Your hamstrings are muscles of hip extension, and they help pull your pelvis underneath you, especially the upper fibers of the hamstring muscle. Meanwhile, the other leg is hanging out in hip flexion, yes, but I like this because when we're moving through the gait cycle, when we're walking or we're running, generally one leg is going to be in more hip extension, the other leg is going to be in more hip flexion, and then we reverse that process. And that's really helpful because the body was designed to do things in a reciprocal, alternating fashion. One side of the body is doing one thing, the other side of the body is doing the other thing. So this is a great way to start to introduce that and drive length through the hip flexor and also train that end range hip extension. My suggestion to you would be to progressively reduce the amount of support underneath your leg, but make sure you use enough in the first place. I'll link down below in the description a link to that exercise. The next A tier exercise is this wall-supported semi-squat with a reach. This is an all-in-one total body exercise. Now, you're not actively stretching out that psoas muscle. You are in relative amounts of hip extension, but the key here is that you're improving the center of gravity control of the body. You are flattening out your low back against the wall a little bit, so you are getting that nice slight stretch. The ball in between the knees is going to serve as a way for you to help create a little bit of internal rotation within your hips, or a little bit more than you would have otherwise without the ball. And also, that wall is giving you a reference to stack your head over your rib cage, over your hips, and keep good, even weight distribution through your foot. And this is going to really address the root cause of the center of gravity issue that a tight psoas can create. The last A tier method is good old-fashioned hip flexor strength training. Now, hear me out on this. Most people that have really tight hip flexor muscles, like their psoas, have them in a shortened state. In order for a muscle to properly recruit and activate, it needs to come from a place of relative elongation. But if we can't get into a place of relative elongation, that muscle's never going to be able to properly be used through its full range of motion. So actually, hip flexors tend to be extremely weak on people relative to other muscles of the hip region. And that can also aid in creating more sensations of tightness and instability within the hips. So actually training your hip flexors through a full range of motion, by the way, is extremely helpful for getting people to feel better in both the short and the long term. These muscles are often weak, and you need to train them and strengthen them. And you might be surprised how much of a difference that makes. I will link down below 2 of my favorite hip flexor strengthening exercises. Now let's move into the final highest tier, the S tier. Things that I recommend mostly everyone tries and does on a consistent basis, especially starting out. So the first S tier exercise is a 90-90 hip lift position with a slight ball squeeze. This hits everything all in one. Let me tell you why. Now you'll see that we are in, yes, 90 degrees of hip bend, but don't let that fool you because your feet are on the wall. And what you're going to be doing is dragging down on the wall, feeling your heels as the thing that's going to help you move into posterior pelvic tilt. So the pelvis is going to tilt underneath us a little bit, but also because we have something in between our knees that we're going to squeeze after we get a little bit of that tilt, that's going to help pull the femur back within the hip socket. So you're addressing this pelvis that's stuck forward and also the femurs that are turned out by pulling the pelvis back and turning the femurs in with that very slight ball squeeze. Shouldn't be very intense, but also because you're focused on creating the connection between the pelvis tilting back and the femurs going in with your heels on the wall, you are basically restoring your center of gravity and educating your body what it means to pull yourself back into this position. So it's an awesome all-in-one exercise. The last S tier exercise is maybe a little bit surprising to you guys. It's going to be a classic bodyweight kickstand hinge. Reason being is that a kickstand hinge, or just any sort of hinge, is going to do a couple of things. It is going to get us deep within our hips, especially in the bottom position, which is going to help open up space like that posterior hip capsule stretch to help restore us from a position where our femurs are turned out to more turned in and improving that space dynamically, by the way. But also we're going to be moving in and out of hip extension. So we're going to be getting deep within our hips, getting a nice stretch and opening of the back of our hips, but then we're going to be able to effectively use our glutes to help stand us up and also get us into that nice fully hip extended position or relative to what we're capable of. If you do this right, this will absolutely crush your glutes within the first 2 to 3 reps, and you should feel it significantly. I will link down below in the description a way that you can effectively do this and how I coach it most commonly. Now, obviously, despite there being a lot of different exercises here, everyone is an individual. So find the ones that work best for you. Maybe play around with some of the C tier stuff to open up some space, but then progressively move into the higher tiers and see what works for you. There are extensive walkthroughs and demonstrations of all the higher tier exercises in the link down below in the description. So check those out, and thank you guys for watching. This is a new concept I've tried in a YouTube video. So if you like stuff like this, you want to see more, let me know in the comments as well. Thank you guys.